of HR policy migration. As many as you can, as fast as you can. I normally don't. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning.
Ready
Good
when
morning,
you are.
everyone. All right. We have brought to you several policies that we are working to move forward for the personnel section. Just in general, just want to let you know these policies reflect our attempt to integrate our current personnel policies into the School Boards Association framework. We've put in places to clarify things for employees and supervisors, and you'll note just throughout all the policies that we've stricken policy references that are not already approved by the board or are not in the process of being approved by the board. So we will start with policy 7425, school administrator contracts. This policy, if approved, will replace policies 2010 and 2021 in the old manual. Most of the changes that you see in the policy will reflect where we have incorporated information from our current policy. So, for example, in the first paragraph, we make it clear that this particular policy doesn't apply to contracts for the superintendent or chiefs or assistant or area superintendent or any administrator who does not have instruction or teaching as a part of their direct supervision. We've also, in section B, we removed an optional sentence that the School Boards Association had, and we made some clarifications about the term to be consistent again with our current practices, which is a 2-year term for initial contracts for our school administrators. Subsequent contracts for principal or assistant principals are 4 years, and then our other school administrators, again, consistent with practice, our contracts are for 2 years for other school administrators who may be central office administrators. Within section C, we have incorporated language from our current policy, and specifically language about the minimum accepted standard of performance will be proficient performance for our administrators. However, that does not constitute an assurance of reemployment or renewal with regard to those administrators. And again, this is coming from our existing policy. In section D, the modifications that you'll see from current policy just lays out a little more of the specifics about when decision notice has to be provided. That's something that's in the statute, but it was also in our current policy, so we went ahead and pulled it over. And also with number 4 in section D, again, the board's timeline to provide information about renewal of those contracts as well. And then section E is, I believe, pretty much verbatim from our current policy. We added this in there just to provide more notice, as we have in our current policy, about what the hearing procedures would be if an administrator's contract was not renewed and what, or not extended, and what their process would be for appealing those contracts.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Ed.
The section E, was that somewhere else before? Because that seemed like a lot to be added.
It is in our current policy. It is in policy number 2010. It's section C in our existing policy
Okay.
with the hearing procedure.
So that would then strike out that section for that entire policy?
Yes, this would completely replace policies 2010 and policy 2021.
Other questions, comments? Hershey?
Motion to move to first reading.
Second.
All right, we have a motion from Mr. Hershey, a second from Mr. Haggerty. We are 6 minutes in and done with the first one.
All right.
What do you have next for us, Ms. Hill?
Next, I have policy 70.
Oh, we do need a vote. All in favor? First reading, I was so excited. Please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. All right, thanks, y'all.
Okay, policy 7440, if approved, this policy will replace from the old manual policy 3320/4320, policy 3321/4312, and policy 3300/4300. So at the beginning of this policy, one of the clarifications we made was to change in the second sentence the wordings in-school transfers to in-school staffing assignment, because we do treat staffing assignments within the school, we don't really call them transfers, it's where they're just moving from one grade level to the next grade level. So that is, we just want to clarify that distinction. We also added a sentence, which is similar to language from our prior policy 3320, that talks about transfers of beginning teachers, and that will be consistent with any applicable provisions in our beginning teacher support plan. And it's my understanding that plan is something that's being reviewed, and this will be a provision in the beginning teacher support plan about transfers of beginning teachers. So we just added that in there to reference that part. We've added a couple of headings into the draft School Boards Association policy just for clarification, and because we did have a separate policy on school system initiated transfers or employer initiated versus employee initiated transfers. So we put those sections in here separately. The modifications that you see in the school system initiated transfer, again, is to incorporate language from our current policy, and to also recognize that an involuntary transfer that would result in a demotion may have some other protections for the employee that are built in, so we just referenced that in the policy language. Finally, in the last part of Section A, appeal of transfer decisions, we referenced that back to our grievance procedures, which is what we would use for those policies. With employee-initiated transfers in Section B, this section's been modified from our current policy, which has some specific dates within the policy, to more generally reference the transfer request period that's established by HR for school-based personnel or school-based teachers and IAs and clerical staff, and to make it clear that during the transfer window, those employees can transfer or request to go to another school without any sort of permission. They can seek other positions without needing permission from their principals. But once the transfer window closes, then those employees would need to have permission from their principals to seek other positions unless it's a position with an increased salary. And then for the rest of our employees, they can submit an application at any time. So, and that's a standard that's been in place for a long time with the district to help protect the school-based instruction once the school year starts, so that we don't have people transferring and leaving one school without appropriate staff after the planning for staff is in place. And so the transfer period is a way to recognize those needs to kind of have that staff established.
Thank you. Mr. Haggerty?
Thank you. So I'm wondering about this. This comes from the School Boards Association, correct?
The 7440, yes, the initial policy.
Okay. And school districts statewide have different practices and procedures in terms of hiring, in terms of how much is school-based and how much is district-based?
So there are some, especially I think in smaller, I won't necessarily say smaller district, but there are some districts where the hiring is solely done at central office. Here, our hiring is a combination of work between the school who initiate the review of candidates, interview of candidates, those sorts of things, and then they make recommendations to HR, who then do an overall review of that candidate's background and ensure that it's consistent with the job description and it's consistent with requirements and expectations, and then make that recommendation onto the board.
Okay. Just to follow up, and I don't know if Dr. Taylor has a comment on this or not. It seems like our principals in Wake County are pretty heavily involved with the hiring and the selection of staff, maybe more than some others, and I just didn't know how much of a change this new policy might be if it's, staff transferring out, the ability of the district to maybe pull staff from some schools to other schools, and if you've considered what principal, is this a change, or is this something the principal reaction would be? You don't think so?
This is not a change. We aren't changing anything in this policy with regard to what our current practices are.
A whole lot of blue, but no changes.
Right. Well, the
Okay.
blue is actually bringing information from our existing policy into this policy, and so
To
we're
clarify it.
to incorporate some of what we're already doing, because the School Boards Association policy is not going to reflect what every individual district is doing. So our attempt here is to incorporate that information. So even though there's blue, it really is blue that's for the majority part of it is coming from our current policy.
Let me make a clarification point. When we are doing migration, and these 7 policies are migration, what you see in black is School Board Association model policy language. So anything in blue is our change to their
Oh,
policy.
okay.
Or us bringing in our current policy.
I understand now. I apologize. I thought the black was our existing policy and the blue was the
No.
migration. All right.
Since these are migrations, that's a sort of
It makes a
fundamental
lot
thing.
more sense now. I apologize.
I
Thank
apologize
you.
for that. I should have clarified that when I sat down, that all of these policies are migration policies.
Okay.
There are times that we start with our existing policy when there is no policy from the School Boards Association where we maybe created a new policy, but these are all migrations into the School Boards Association.
Thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
Thank you for that question.
Mr. Swanson and then Ms. Rice.
Thank you. And thank you for the work that went into this. I just had a question under Section B when it talked about the employee-initiated transfers. I know it specifies that the principal and the employee must agree on a release date. Is there a maximum time frame that a principal can hold a teacher in that position? Because I don't think it gives some may do 30, some may do beyond. So I think, can we clarify what is the quote-unquote max that they can hold an employee in that position?
So first, let me just clarify with this. This is when an employee is outside the transfer window and is seeking to transfer to another school. And so their current principal gives permission outside, has to give permission outside the transfer window for them to transfer to another position. We don't have a set amount of time in terms of the release of that employee, and that is certainly something we can consider. And AJ, if you have any guidance on that, I know that in general, a teacher has to give 30 days notice if they're going to resign from a position. But there is not a set time for us to do that. Sometimes I think the flexibility is there sometimes because of that need to, try to get some assistance within that classroom or set something up when that classroom is getting ready to be opened up. But I'll see if AJ has any other thoughts.
I think more used to be we could rely on principals to work it out between themselves, and HR would not get involved as much. But as staffing has become a bit more challenging over the couple of years, we have had to intervene when principals can't work it out. And generally, we do like a 30 or a 60-day maximum time if the principals can't work it out. I don't recall if they're doing 30 or 60. If that's something the board would like to put into policy, I can certainly go back to the talent acquisition team and see what kind of standard we're using and bring that back to you
So
all.
if I may do a follow-up, I think there needs to be some consistency because you have some principals that may do 30, some may do 60, and it's not, and sometimes employees request a transfer for a fresh start. And if that fresh start is needed, you don't need to hold that person back and being penalized. So I would love to see some language in there that specifies whether it's 30 or 60.
Do you have a preference, or would you rather wait and see what talent acquisition
I would
has to
think
say?
30 would be consistent. If you have to submit a resignation form 30 days prior, I think we should just stick to 30. That's just my opinion.
Ms. Rice?
Kind of in the same vein, I have questions around even the school-initiated transfer, or if there's, and I may be in the wrong section, but we have, I think sometimes we will have job offers that may come to staff because there has been where they've had to transfer out because, they had to shift around within the system. But what about the place where staff is offered a position and then, because they have to be transferred throughout the district, right? What happens when they choose to say, no, I don't want this position, I want to wait around to see if other positions come available?
Just for
I might be the
clarification,
wrong-
are you referencing displaced staff?
That might be what it is, yeah. More, I'm sorry, yeah, that's what I was, the displaced staff. Is that in the same policy with the transfer? Is that under that in some sort? I may be wrong.
We haven't, it's not addressed in this policy, and I don't think displacement is addressed in any particular policy. I think it's just in our practices or procedures that HR puts in place if employees have to be displaced. So, for example, and just let me make sure I'm understanding. If someone has lost student numbers, and so they've lost some positions. Is that what you're referencing?
Right,
And we have
right.
to. So, talent acquisition section of HR has in place standards that they use for displacement of employees, and that offering a position. First of all, which employees are displaced. That's something that's there in those standards, and then offering the time frame for employees to be able to respond to a position that they've been given for displacement purposes. I have talked to them about that. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think they do provide a time period for the employee to determine if they're going to accept that position. I believe they provide potentially another position, but at some point they have to kind of, we have open positions. Here are the open positions that we have available. Employees are always still, if they're looking for things, especially if they're a displaced employee, they're still able to, I believe, look for other positions that might be appropriate for them. But the displacement is HR's effort to put them somewhere because their position has been moved.
Right, and so I thank you for clarifying that. That's exactly what I'm talking
Okay.
about. And so with that, where do we leave some of our schools that may be in most vulnerable populations to have the ability to still keep good quality teachers who want to hold out for possibly a different type of school, even though they're displaced at the moment? This is available, you interviewed here, this it is, you're being offered the position, but you're holding out in case something else comes open. Like, how are we handling that?
So I'll turn it over to AJ to talk about displacement more, because that's in another section.
Can I also reference what you asked me to look into?
Yeah, I was about to get into that.
So, a couple of things. I think with regard to the displacements, and those usually happen because a school is losing an enrollment, or maybe it's a school that's magnetized or retheming their magnet, and that teacher doesn't want to be a part of that, or they're not selected. So those folks, we generally try to find a match. It works best when early in the process, a teacher wants to go to a school and a school wants to take that teacher on. Some schools can be resistant to just HR saying, here's your new teacher, and some teachers are resistant to HR saying, here's your new school. You know, we look at factors like distance from home and what level they've been teaching and those kinds of things. But there does come to a point, especially later in that window into the summertime, especially once July hits, where it's like, we need to find a place for you. Like Kendra said, here are openings. We have to put you here. Dr. Taylor has asked me separately to look into our transfer practices a little bit to try to protect some of those vulnerable schools who, outside of displacements, they feel like they're the warm-up or the JVs or
Right.
the foot in the door to the district.
I have a list of those
And then, you know, employees look to turn around right away and find what they consider more desirable or some kind of different school. So our transfer practices now don't provide a lot of parameters. So we're looking to, does it make sense to say when you come into the district, you will be at the school for X number of years, just to provide some kind of consistency. So that's something that we're working on currently. And obviously, if we are able to do that, we'd bring that back separate from migration and look to implement that prior to this, 24-25 transfer window heading into the 25-26 school year.
Yeah, I would really like to see that. It looks like Dr. Taylor is on top of it. I think we're in the same vein around that process. Because I think every school in Wake is great as long as we provide the appropriate training for all of our teachers, and all of our teachers always have to understand that every child is important and every child can learn.
And I want to be clear about the intentions of this particular move, because I know in the light of teacher shortage and the fear of losing a teacher, I do understand that. But what I want people to understand is that when people view a school as the JV or the warm-up, we get that. And if that teacher is allowed to leave, that school is without the person. But if we say you have to remain a particular amount of time, and that school, that desirable school, they're going to always be able to fill those positions. They have people that are waiting, but we want teachers to understand that if you come to Wake County, we do want you to commit, particularly when we come to these high-need schools. And I think this is a way to prevent that from happening. Without that kind of protection, that school is going to always end up with a vacancy anyway, and the other school is always going to have people lined up. And so that's what we're looking at, and once we get that, we'll be able to bring that back, and we hope that's going to move us in a positive direction.
Just one last thing. I thank you for what you said, Dr. Taylor. And I just wanted to be reiterated and understood. We shouldn't be looking at any of our schools as a JV or under of anything. And the fact that we know around this table and in community that that's a thought process is a culture that we have to make a very strategic and a very aggressive effort on trying to change from our HR practices all the way down into the base of the school. So I think that is something that we need to keep in mind around the table, that we know that those barriers are there in our thought processes and our implicit biases that we need to work on collectively.
Ms. Johnson-Hostler?
I couldn't agree more, and thank you, Dr. Taylor. One of the things we've discussed for as long as I've been on this board, and it actually has not come up in a very long time, and that is actually before AJ was in HR. So maybe David, Nita, and I might be the only people who remember this conversation in the room. But we had a lot of conversations about, does Wake County need to go to a place that teachers belong to Wake County and not a school? Because it's what you said, but the greater issue is everyone knows in this district, I'm an individual, and if I want to work at this school, I can, and it's about that school, and not seeing this as a school district. And certainly, when we did the research many years ago, there are several districts where teachers work for the district. Therefore, the district could say, thank you very much for those high scores. You now get to go to this school. Wake, at the time, has never wanted to do that. But again, when I went to Dr. Taylor with this as a concern for me, the bigger issue is, and I mean, the good news is they weren't calling it JV. They just didn't want to work at low-performing schools because it impacted their persona as a teacher. And it really was not being able to see themselves as a teacher, but more so the school defining who they were professionally. And I think in order to really transition that, the conversation really has to be about this is a school district. And again, we have not had that conversation in a very long time because it's a hard conversation to have, because it also moves us to the conversation which we weren't ready for at the time, and that is really how do you differentiate for schools who really need the district to be differentiating so that those schools can be successful.
All right, and I want to circle back because we're going to get to the policy
And
on
David has his
displaced
hand.
teachers, or there is not a policy yet. And David, I know you have some thoughts, but we have a lot to get through that's in front of us, and I welcome this conversation. We certainly appreciate that piece of it. I want to circle back to what Mr. Swanson raised, which is the last sentence under, not the last sentence under B, but the last sentence on that page under B. If a school-based teacher, instructional assistant, or clerical staff member wishes to transfer outside the transfer window, the employee must receive permission from the principal unless the position is an increase in salary, and the employee's principal and the prospective principal must agree on the date of the employee's release. There was talk of a 30-day or a 60-day hold. Mr. Swanson prefers a 30-day. I wanted to get a feel around the table of what we thought, and Dr. Taylor, your perspective. So, Dr. Taylor, why don't you start, and then
I mean,
Yeah.
I certainly like having a defined period, and I'm amenable to the 30 days. I think that's great. It makes it more clear.
Okay, so what, is there other folks thinking 30 days? Okay, 60 days? Ms. Edmonds?
Yeah, I just, having not been an educator, I just want to make sure that that's not, and I appreciate hearing your input, Dr. Taylor, because I don't want to micromanage to that level. So if it, for you, if that doesn't raise flags, and I know, Tyler, you've been in the classroom, and I appreciate your perspective as well, but that was my only concern when you said that, was like, is that getting too far dictating how this goes? But if you are not concerned, I'm not concerned.
So I think what I'm hearing is put the 30 days in. Yep, Ms. Dr.
Yeah.
Matillo and Dr. Crane.
I don't know that I'm disagreeing with 30 days, but I just wanted to speak out loud what I'm thinking. So a school has a teacher who they are then going, agree to release, right, to another school, which is one ask of the principal. Are you going to agree to this transfer? Is 30 days enough for that school then to post, interview, hire, potentially give notice to, you know, their employer before they come on? I just don't want to necessarily create a hardship at the sending school to fill a need at the receiving school. I don't know that 30 or 60, like, I don't know what the right answer is, but that's just something I think I want us all to think about before we finalize the number.
So based on what you know, what has kind of been the average when principals work it out? I mean, I don't know if you have any
Yeah,
idea what that might look like.
I don't have an average, and I'm trying to message the team to see what standard they've been using. It probably runs the
And
gamut.
we can always
I
put
think it
30
was,
days
yeah.
as a placeholder, and then when it comes to the board table, if there's a need for change. And Ms. Caulfield and Mr. Swanson.
I was just
Dr.
going to ask if we could possibly find some verbiage that does the both and end. If there's 30 days, if there's a hardship, if they need to go to 60 days, if that's what they agree, that if, unless there's a hardship, that they could do 30 days. Because I would hate to see a teacher be in a position where he or she felt they needed to be somewhere else, and that's why they were asking for the transfer. Is that going to affect the students?
That's what we just,
That's what we
yeah,
just talked about.
completely agree.
Yeah.
So maybe we can have verbiage that fits both.
That's kind of.
Mr.
That's what we just
Swanson,
said.
and then back to Dr. Crane and Ms. Hill.
And I think that's also a good point of why we have full-time building subs. Some of those building subs can step up and fill those positions until the appropriate person is there. So I think, there's no need to keep a person in a position that they don't want to be in to cause more harm. And just like our students need a fresh start, our teachers need a fresh start. And I think as a district, if we want to recruit and retain our teachers, we have to honor those requests and put something in policy so therefore teachers understand that their rights are valid. Because a lot of teachers don't know what they don't know. And if your boss is saying you have to stay in this position, and there's no wiggle room, then if I have another position and this principal is saying this, how do I know the other principal's not going to say this?
Yeah.
And so therefore, instead of staying in education, I'll just resign and do something else. So it hurts our students, it hurts our reputation as a district. So I think that we need to put something in writing. Even if we're already doing it, that's great, but not everyone looks at our policies until they need them. So I think it needs to be put there.
See, some language that I had drafted was to add at the end of the sentence, no later than 30 days except in extraordinary circumstances as approved by the Assistant Superintendent of Human Resources or designee.
I mean, I prefer the senior director.
Sorry, AJ,
Yes,
with
yeah.
great power comes great responsibility. Ms. Ray?
So with Ms. Hill, I love that ending statement that you made there. Can you give me a little bit of clarity around the accept as approved? And I'm talking about human behaviors here, right? I'm talking about everybody being human, and some days are good days, some days are not so good days. What does that look like with, what exception is that? Because we don't want that to be the go-to if the principal cannot manage certain things going on to get that done, and then falls back and contacts HR and is like, hey, you know, X, Y, and Z, and then we're pushing stuff back, which then comes back to what Mr. Swanson was saying. So what does that look like? What parameters are around, or I don't know if this is an R&P situation around answering that
What's
last.
the messaging to principals? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
Yeah,
you,
can you
but
read
what's the
that
messaging
last
to
line one more
principals so
time,
they
please?
understand it?
No later than 30 days except in extraordinary circumstances as approved by the Assistant Superintendent.
Define what's the extraordinary circumstances, because I'm just talking about human behavior
Right.
here and experiences across the district, and concerns around HR. What are we defining as these extreme, because it's going to change from one person to the other. And I'm not trying to be picky, but I'm being
No,
realistic.
but a vacancy is not an extraordinary circumstance, but a special education vacancy that's pending may seem like an extraordinary circumstance, but that teacher may also need a fresh start, as Mr. Swanson said.
Right.
So special ed vacancy was actually something that I was thinking about and that Sally had mentioned as well. So that, for example, if it's a principal in a classroom where they need to get a, certain type of employee in there to handle a classroom prior to releasing that employee. They want to go ahead and make sure they have someone ready to come in. That might be a situation where, in order to serve the needs of the student, we need to hold that teacher beyond 30 days. But again, if 60 days is our, is our sort of cap or internal maximum, then that's something I think that HR can lay out internally in their standards or expectations with regard to that. So HR would, as we have to do with other policies, where we go in and say, okay, this is what the language is, and here are the standards that we're putting in to say. But that's just one example. You need to meet some of the requirements with regard to this child, and you need to make sure you have someone who's able to come in and meet those requirements, or at least have the training they need before that person can be released, or things like that.
So is that more of the both and that Ms. Caulfield was talking about by putting the, assistant superintendent no more than 60 days? I mean, because we have schools that open with vacancies, right? Because somebody decides not to renew their contract because they leave. This is specifically for folks that want to move outside of the transfer window, which is in February?
February to May-ish, yeah.
Yeah.
For the next-
For the next
I
one.
mean, right, so we're talking about approximately how many folks are looking to transfer outside of that window generally?
I wouldn't say a lot.
And then special ed though, if someone's trying to leave, because to be mindful the challenges that teacher may be facing, even though we're talking about getting someone to replace it. And I'm not throwing out random situations, guys. I'm really throwing out as close as I can be to real active situations that have happened in past or whatever. teachers being in the class of our special needs students where there is physical aggression and they may need to leave that space and things like that. So it's not that I'm throwing things out there to bring roadblocks, but it's really consideration of what's really happening in those classrooms. So of what that looks like, if we're saying no more than 60 days, but we're saying under these circumstances, and we're all talking about thinking about BST classrooms, of saying, hey, we need to make sure before you leave, this person has this skill and that skill. How do we still accommodate what Mr. Swanson was saying and Ms. Cofield, that they still need to leave?
So my experience, and it may be different for, the talent acquisition side, but when I'm dealing with people in the employee relations side, when a teacher is requesting to leave, I don't find principals who have given permission for that teacher to seek to leave attempting to hold them for a very long time. That's just my experience. Normally, once a principal says, okay, yes, they can look to do something else, then they're already planning, they're already willing to release that teacher. So I don't find them holding teachers for a very long time once that teacher is able to find that position. That's not to say it doesn't happen, because it sounds like you've talked to some folks with some experience and that sort of thing. But I think there is a balance that happens there. We are trying to meet the needs that the students may have in the classroom, recognizing that the principal has given this person the permission to go ahead and seek a position outside of that window, which means that the principals also agree that, it may be in the employee's best interest, or they don't want to hold someone who doesn't want to be at the school or something like that. So the willingness to grant that permission to seek that position outside of the transfer window is already a step that shows the willingness of the principal to kind of work with the employee. But I think that it would be incumbent upon HR to define where we put those parameters around that. But I think we're hearing what you all are saying, and you want to make sure that those parameters are clear and are established within the context of what we're saying here.
Or at least with what you're saying with the both and, even allowing if there's some way or language that if there still has to be the whole, if the teacher has the ability to share that they understand there has to be a whole, but they're really desiring to move forward, so that they have an option, so they don't feel boxed in. Because like you said, you're not aware, but you understand that we are having some instances that there are. Because sometimes if people know that they can't leave, it's best to just be quiet, and we don't want to contain that culture of fear or doing things because of obligation while they're internally hurting or suffering in silence, so to speak, for the sake of trying to be the team player when we know it's affecting them emotionally, which plays out into the classroom where no one isn't always watching. That's it. That's
I
all.
certainly feel like putting the 30 days in there sets the expectations for the supervisors. This is where we expect this to happen. It's rare that you're going to go beyond that. I think that's the language that HR would be communicating moving forward based upon you guys putting in the 30 days.
May I ask one question? Sorry. I just wanted to ask one question just for clarification. I assume what I'm hearing, the focus of the discussion is consistency for principals, the ability of the principal to say, I'm not going to allow the transfer per policy, you don't have my consent. But it's not necessarily to give a guarantee for the teacher who wants the transfer that will be processed in that school year. For example, say the request for the transfer is right at the end of the school year, would leave the school in a lurch to have that vacancy. There's no possibility to fill the position before the integrate testing. Are we still okay with the idea that the superintendent ultimately approves or doesn't approve the transfer? And the consistency that you're looking for is just as to what the principals can control. Did I state that clearly? I just want to make sure that's right, because that will impact the language we use. We need to be careful to not lock in a guaranteed right to get a transfer out of the school you're trying to flee. Per the previous discussion we just had, that can be an issue for the district, right? Teachers want out of the low-performing schools, maybe towards the end of the school year. That's not a right. It's just that the principal has a limit on what the principal can withhold consent for 30 days? Is that?
In that circumstance, the first thing is that the principal decide, because it's outside of the transfer window. I mean, it could be, the transfer window is for the next school year. So if I'm saying.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so it's outside of the transfer window for that employee to request any time during the school year to move. So if the employee is, if it's October and the employee is seeking to move to another school, the principal has to give permission because we're outside of the transfer window. If it's February and the employee is seeking to move this school year, the principal has to give permission because it's outside the transfer window. So the
Right.
transfer window sets up movement for the following school
Okay,
year.
so
So
I-
essentially, anything during this school year, once everything is set in place, would be the principal giving permission for that. And then the rest of this language is about, okay, once the principal gives permission for you to go and you actually find a position, because then you have to find a position. Once you find a position at another school, the two principals decide on the date, and the question is, how long can your original principal hold you? And that's what Mr. Swanson was recommending, 30 days be the max that your original principal can hold you once you have.
For transfer within this current school year?
Within
Because
this school
everything
year.
for next year will be captured by the transfer.
Yeah,
window. Okay.
within the school year, once you found a position for yourself.
And your building principal has already given you permission to.
Right.
Ms. Coffield?
I was just wondering, with the verbiage that you just said, because I didn't get to write it all, is there a max of 60 days, or is that in the discretion of somebody else's?
I did not recommend that in the verbiage because you guys were talking about 30 days. Dr. Martillo mentioned that generally in his experience it's around 30 to 60 days. But I had not recommended that, but obviously that's something you all, if you want to.
Because speaking of, having examples, I do have a few where it did go well beyond the 60 and the teacher left.
That's why we said 30.
So that's why I feel like we should have some kind of max to put out there.
So I have a slightly different wording, if just to run by you, because that's why I wanted clarification on what we're trying to do, is just limit the principal's discretion only. What if we were to add at the end of the first clause in the sentence, that it would read, if a school-based teacher, instructional assistant, or clerical staff member wishes to transfer outside of the transfer window or within 30 days after submission of the transfer request, the employee must receive permission from the principal. Does that capture the idea? So if you're outside the transfer window and you're not giving at least 30 days notice, you need the permission of both principals.
So I thought we were looking at the end of the sentence. So the principal giving permission was never in question. What it was the second part of that sentence.
That the
And
date of
Mr.
the-
Swanson, do you want to clarify what you're talking about? So I'm not putting words in your mouth.
No less than 30 days.
Dr. Green's got it.
Oh, well, perfect. Thank you, Dr. Crane.
Oh, so my thought was at the very end, the prospective principal, the employee's principal and the prospective principal must agree on the date of the employee's release.
Which must be at least 30 days after.
No,
No later than 30
the
days.
day of
is
the
the
employee's
limit.
release, which should occur no later than 30 days after the agreement. Basically, the release has to happen within no later than. The release
Of the
has to
date of
happen
the
no
agreement.
later than 30 days. Shall or shall not exceed 30 days.
Because remember that these two principals have agreed that they want the person to leave. And so I think that's going to be the key part, that if they've already made that agreement, and you know the person is coming, and if we can try to do that within 30 days, I think you said for the most part it kind of happens, but it creates a greater expectation to avoid a situation where it might be untenable for that teacher and they want to get out. But they've already made that agreement that they want the person to come.
So it's not on the principal permission part, it is on the, when the person may leave. So I think we have that settled, and we can reaffirm once the language is a little more solid at the board, at first reading.
And the language that I have right now is, which will be no later than 30 days, except in extraordinary circumstances as approved by the Assistant Superintendent of HR or designee.
feel
Unless
settled on that?
unless you don't
Unless you
want
get-
that
right.
provision.
I'm cautious about the extraordinary circumstances piece, just a little bit, unless I mean,
I mean-
everybody's okay
We have
with
to
it. I
bring this
just
to
think
first
that
reading, or
Yeah.
can we
it's a
just-
lot of wiggle
We can
room with
table this
that.
and we can bring it
Yeah.
back later.
Yes.
We can bring it to first reading and rediscuss
I
it.
think we can get, if it's not a rush.
We can also see how it goes, and if it's, extraordinary circumstances happen more often than not, then we can bring it back and put it, so we have a myriad of options in front of us right now.
I think it might be helpful to have a little more time just to.
Let's bring it back
run
next
through
month.
If it's not a rush.
Okay, let's do that, and so we will see this again in
I
September.
think Ms. Hill has something.
Yes.
My recommendation would be for us to move it forward, but clarify that language, because we're just talking about whether we think there are extraordinary circumstances and whether we want to just strike that language or not. And that gives AJ a chance to see what sorts of circumstances have created beyond 30 days.
I see some head nods on that. Okay, so is there a motion to send it to first reading?
So moved.
Okay, we have a motion and second to send it to first reading, with the caveat that we'll get that new language. And if we find out that this is not the practice and what the intention is, then we can always bring it back. All in favor of sending this to first reading, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? I believe next, I have 7810, evaluations of licensed employees. Ms. Hill, are we on the same page, or?
We are on the same page.
Okay.
So this policy would replace policy 3230 in the old manual. And as you see, there are not a whole lot of changes to the language that the School Boards Association has laid out in this policy. We added in the third paragraph just a reference to the state board policies dealing with evaluation. And then at the end of that paragraph, we just made this consistent with our policy or our practices that the principal evaluates the assistant principal. I think in their language, it could be the superintendent evaluating them. That's not the way we do it. The next paragraph we included with regard to the NESIS system for evaluation unless provided otherwise by state law, because there is some flexibility with Restart Schools with regard to their evaluation system. So we added that in there as well. And then the second page of the policy, we removed from this page some of the more specific items that were already mandated in state board policy and in the policies that we had already referenced, and some of the language already at the beginning of the policy, just to kind of lay out the expectations more for supervisors and not have them think, oh no, these are additional things that we have to be doing, versus what we've already laid out at the beginning of the policy. So we struck those things that are that we felt like were incorporated in the, like, peer observations. That's already a part of what's required under the state board policies. We didn't feel like it was necessary to lay those out here again. But to really say, our expectation is that supervisors and principals have open communication about performance concerns and those sorts of performance expectations. So that's what you'll see in the numbered sections, number 1 through 7, that we really try to just focus on those expectations that we want our supervisors and our employees to understand about the evaluation system. And then just as an FYI on what is the new number 5, we modified that to say that evaluations will be submitted, because nowadays there's not that sort of submission process. Stuff just flows. So we just corrected that. But those are the changes there with regard to policy 7810.
Questions? Comments? Motions?
Just a quick one. I appreciate the links that you have, but I think that's helpful to actually get you to something else. So just a quick comment, for sure.
Chair, I move that we move this to first reading.
We have a motion from Ms. Edmonds. Second from Ms. Rice. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Next up, 7811, plans for growth and improvement of licensed employees.
So this is a long one.
Yep.
However, the last 3 pages are cut, so perhaps that helps some. So we have taken this policy, and it's really a policy that details the different plans that the school system puts in place to help an employee with improving their performance with our licensed employees. And we have different components of those plans. Just as general information, we moved or struck some areas for clarity, for simplicity, and for consistency with our practices. And we are, in the district, we mostly use monitored professional development plans, or PDPs, or directed PDPs when we're dealing with employee improvement plans for our licensed employees. And so you'll see that that's really the part that we maintained in here and worked through with regard to that. One of the things you'll see early on in the definition section is that although this policy talks about growth plans, the language that's being used today is normally professional development plans. However, the state board policy still calls it growth plans, even though DPI also uses the language of professional development plans. So we added this number 4 just to say it's all the same thing. Professional development plan, growth plans, we're all talking about the same thing. When you look at section B in this document, we added language from our current policy to talk about our use of monitored and directed plans, and that the idea is that if a teacher is not proficient, then they must demonstrate significant and sustained improvement by on a monitored plan or a directed plan, and that the placement on a plan is a warning that an employee has to improve their performance and compliance with the plan with a monitored or directed or mandatory plan is something that's mandatory for our employees. So that's a section in number 1 there that comes out of our current policy. And number 2, dealing with components of plans, we just listed these components and removed some of the details explaining what each component was. We just felt like that was something that is already built into the plans in terms of the information that goes in there, and we didn't need to lay out in every section of this policy what it meant to identify deficiencies or to set expectations and goals. So we just indicated that the plans have to include those provisions. And then we also included in here the minimum requirements for a monitored plan, the minimum requirements for a directed plan, what is required to review those plans. On number 3 under section B, which is on page 3, we included in here language from our current policy that to ensure that students receive quality instruction, a teacher who hasn't attained proficient performance with the use of a monitored or directed plan ordinarily will be recommended for dismissal or renewal. However, there are some other provisions in here that says in extraordinary circumstances they'll be placed on a mandatory improvement plan, essentially if they're not non-renewed or dismissed, or that the teacher will be moved to a new plan if they're already showing improvement and the principal can say, okay, they're improving on this, let's just keep them moving on a plan so that we can hopefully have continuous growth with regard to that employee. Section C of this document includes plans related to principals and assistant principals. The first part is just generally their professional growth plans or plans that the principals and APs have in place. And then we added in and decided to include this optional action plan or improvement goals, which is what we call them, for our APs and principals if they do have some concerns, and how to include improvement goals within the regular plan that they have, and again, those components, identifying performance deficiencies, laying out the expectations and goals, strategies, and dates for them to complete those improvement goals as well. Then with regard to our, again, section B, this would be page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, talks about, what happens when that employee it has not improved, and what the board will do in terms of a principal AP during their improvement plan, and them not improving their work and the options available there. Section D talks about mandatory improvement plans. Again, this is something we don't use a whole lot in the district because state policy allows us to use a monitored plan in those situations where a mandatory plan is required. And so that's often what we would do. So you'll see in here, for example, first we put in our current policy language that talks about an employee on a mandatory improvement plan where the monitored plan hasn't adequately addressed the employee's deficiencies, that the superintendent or designee may decide to place them on a mandatory improvement plan. Some of the language with regard to requirement of observations for employees that are on those plans and who will be a qualified observer. And then again, on the next page, the specific language that our monitored plans or other plans or growth plans may function as a mandatory improvement plan as long as it reflects all of the areas that are required for those plans. The next section, number 1, talks about the components of a mandatory improvement plan. And then number 2, and you'll see green in these areas because we move information from within the School Boards Association policy. So that's what green represents. We've just moved it around.
I appreciate that.
We've added a section number 2 to specifically sort of consolidated the information with regard to mandatory improvement plans for employees in schools designated as low performing. And that's something where these are all required plans when a school is designated as low performing, that it's supposed to be a mandatory improvement plan for those employees. But again, we are able to use the monitored plan as long as it includes these provisions of the mandatory improvement plan to ensure that we're meeting the needs of those employees who may be in a low performing school and who have performed below proficiency. So the policy here just again incorporates the language from the School Boards Association policy. It also includes in that language, because there is a possibility that a team would come in to a low performance school and put someone on a plan, so it does incorporate the language of the individual as well as potentially a team coming in and putting someone on these plans. It includes language about creating the plan and then reassessing whether the employee has become proficient under that plan, and if they have not, then a potential recommendation for the employee to be dismissed, demoted, or non-renewed due to not improving under the mandatory improvement plan. So from that point on, we just essentially struck the rest of the language that we either moved or that we consolidated to not be so meaty that we felt like it would kind of confuse folks more with so many details with regard to a plan that we often don't use or rarely use, if at all, in this district.
So, thank you. And in reading this, section B had lifted up a question for me, and that was, how do we determine that a teacher who's put on a growth plan needs the plan because of performance, or if it's just a clash of different educational philosophies between the administrator and the teacher?
Well, the plan comes into place if the teacher receives a rating of less than proficient on their evaluation. That's normally the circumstance where a plan would come into place. So once the administrator is evaluating the teacher and that teacher, as part of the summary evaluation process, the teacher is able to submit artifacts, the teacher meets with the evaluator, and has an opportunity to review the evaluation, provide information, request any modifications to the evaluation. But once that process is done and the evaluation results in a standard rating that is less than proficient, and that's what dictates what happens on the plan. And then the supervisor, the principal, works with Chris Vaughn on the employee relations team is our performance person for the district, and so she works with all of our supervisors who have people licensed and classified to help them create plans for their employees. So she's able to work with them to create a plan that reflects the issues that were the basis of the non-proficient rating. So that's the way that works, is with the monitor plan. It's something where the supervisor and the employee are together, coming up with those goals to reflect the issues that were noted in the evaluation. And then with the directed plan, that's the supervisor who puts those areas in place if there are still concerns with regard to the monitor, or if the ratings are at the rating level that requires the directed plan.
Did I see you? Okay, I'm sorry. I thought I saw a hand in that direction. Any other questions? Ms. Rice?
So I just have a few questions around the personal growth plans for principals. So I did notice, and I heard you say around taking away the meaty parts of things, I think to condense it, which is what, Section 8?
Well, right, the definitions, like.
Right, the definitions are,
Under principals and APs.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they did the same.
Yeah, we did the same thing in that
Same
section.
thing with teachers too.
Mm-hmm.
So will the principals have with their evaluation in rubrics the definitions themselves outside of policy? Because I would really like to see them move in what you have just explicit here in policy, to see them follow, and we might could see a little bit more unified performance of evaluations. And so my concern is, even though I know we're taking it out to lean the policy a little bit, I think that it's important to make sure that everybody understands the definition in which we're using to define what their goals and objectives are supposed to be with doing the evaluation on both ends, both teacher and with the principal. For me, principals specifically, because they're the leaders of our school, and we want to make sure that, they're getting the most out of their evaluations to build a better school. So my concern is, I know we took it out, but I'm okay that if we took it out, but I need to know where these definitions will be for these principals, whether current, new, or whatever. Where would these definitions be for them as their template and their model, that they understand this is what that practice actually looks like, versus them assuming what it looks like.
So let me clarify. I think I call these definitions, but they're kind of explanations. So if you look under where you were talking about the principal section, for number 1, identification of performance deficiencies, it says all performance and conduct deficiencies identified in the evaluation must be identified and addressed in the plan. So it's sort of it's not necessarily a definition. It's something that is. What we said is the plan must include identification of performance deficiencies. So the sentence is sort of explanatory, but it really is, I think, not necessary to explain that you want to identify performance deficiency. It doesn't it's not adding anything. So that's why we didn't feel like we needed to say those specifically here. But when someone is working on performance improvement plans, we do have some documents that we normally use in order to create those plans. It lays out specifically that you have to, for example, specify the strategies that go into the plan, and that you have to identify what the performance. So those things are within the documents that are used to craft the plan. I certainly can go back and make sure that that the specific language is there as well, but it is incorporated into the plans as well, where, I mean, it is laid out, where you specify what the performance deficiencies are. You specify what the expectations are. You specify what the strategies for improvement are. You specify what the dates and expectations with regard to dates are. Those are laid out there.
I'm glad
Okay.
you explained it. Because strategies was my struggle. I was
Yeah.
like, this is very explicit. It says per deficiency, who's responsible. That would not be self-explanatory by just telling me strategies for deficiency. So if it's in the document that they receive, that makes me feel a little bit better.
Yeah.
Because we both were having a moment of like, there's no way I would know you wanted me to list the people who are responsible in this strategy for my deficiency, for each deficiency. I mean, that's pretty.
Understood.
So, Ms. Johnson-Hostler summed it up. As long as it's really in the document explicit about what they need, how they need to improve, I think that matters. I think that'll help the area
She feels you
superintendents.
may want
and the
to
chief.
give some insight, but what I can tell you is that staff really go into detail when they know a person is deficient and have the specifics about what the expectations are, the dates, because the expectation is that if we have to bring something to the board to say that a person has to be dismissed, and we've gone into great detail, and that has been my experience. I can only know that's the same expectation here, right?
It's the exact same. So even before it gets to HR and reviewing this policy, an area superintendent will have to sit with me to talk about what those concerns are and how it relates to the improvement. And so it is really, it's more explicit than probably what it feels like because of how the policy is being read. But they, area superintendent, they meet with me. Then I send them and make sure they have a meeting with the employee relations team, Kendra, and that team to review it. And it is always based on those strategies. And just because of my experience with it, as well in 2 districts, you have to make sure that once you give the concern, there must be a strategy. And it does say who's responsible for it, what's the follow-up, if we're going to have something related to how academics might be supporting that teacher, we put that in there, and so that those things are really spelled out.
That makes sense. Thank you for clarifying.
We also, and AJ mentioned this, we also have on our website how to choose the appropriate development plan for PDP for your employee. It lays out what the standards are, like what did the employee receive in their evaluation, and then it lays out some of the goals and outcomes and information expected by those plans. So that's something that all of our administrators have access to on our evaluation website for licensed personnel. And we have a separate section for evaluators of those employees, and that's one of the things there, as well as, the appropriate evaluation cycle for them to be on, and all of that available for our employees.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Do we have a motion to send this to first reading?
So moved.
We have a motion by Ms. Ray. Second by Mr. Hershey. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? All right, moving on to 7815, evaluation of non-licensed employees.
Yes.
We're good?
Yes,
Okay.
we're ready. 7815. So this policy replaces our current policy 4230. And It is pretty consistent with the policy you already saw for licensed employee in terms of laying out those standards that we want our employees and our supervisors to know and to follow those expectations with regard to our employees, like appropriate communication about performance concerns or how an employee can request information if they have questions about performance. The only thing that we added in here from our current policy was to, in the very first paragraph, to indicate that non-licensed employees may be evaluated at any time, including at the end of the first 3 months of employment and annually. Our current practice is generally to evaluate our classified employees and non-licensed employees 3 months on a probationary evaluation when they are new to a position or new to a location, and then the annual evaluation. If there are performance concerns, then we also have what we call a conditional evaluation, where the employee is given an opportunity to show growth, show improvement over that time period, and then be reevaluated if they have employment concerns. But this policy, again, the 1 through 7 in this policy, 1 through 6 in this policy, I'm sorry, 7, I can't read, is consistent with our policy that we just showed you on licensed employees.
Are there any questions on this? There's a motion. Send to first reading.
So moved.
Second.
All right, motion by Mr. Hershey, second by Mr. Hagerty. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? All right. 7820 personnel files.
Policy 7820 would replace our current policy 3231, which is our personnel file policy. And this policy, we basically followed the information that the School Boards Association had in here, except with some clarifying language that we had with regard to making sure our employees understood and our supervisors and HR staff understood some of the information. So, for example, with the records maintained in number 4 here, we make it clear a lot of our records are maintained by DPI now. And so, whereas it used to be that we received a sort of carbon copy of a licensure document that we placed in a person's file, those things are on the DPI website now, so we don't necessarily pull all of that down. So we just wanted to make that clear so that our employees didn't feel like we have to go back and start like printing stuff down to put in our file when it's already maintained at the state level. And then we also, just in number 9, in terms of other pertinent records, we put in here the types of records that are a part of the personnel file, relating to application, selection, promotion, demotion, evaluation, disciplinary action, all of those things. The next section dealing with employee records that are maintained separately. One of the things that we modified in the criminal records section is where it says that the records must be maintained in a locked and secure location. We don't have printed documents that are locked. And the information related to the locked and secure location really is related to records that come through the Department of Justice, and we use a third-party vendor to do our criminal record checks. And so they're just generally different standards related to that, but we just changed it to say in a secure manner because those records are kept separate and apart from the rest of our records. And then this just lays out other records like medical information, things like that, that are kept in a separate place with regard to our employee information as required. The section C dealing with placement of records in the personnel file, we felt like we wanted to make sure that our supervisors understood the standards for placing records in the file, and that records would not be put in the file if there were questionable concerns with regard to the records, because this part of the law talks about complaints against employees and how those complaints go to the file. And I can tell you, and Sally is our grievance and complaint person, we get lots of complaints, lots and lots of things where people have conflict sometimes between employees and things like that. And something going to a personnel file is pretty significant. And so this policy makes it clear, like we need to have an eye on those things, make sure that there's been an attempt to resolve issues and things like that before a document just goes to the personnel file and could impact someone in that way by being placed in the personnel file. One of the things that we added in number 4 under section C is that documents would be, or we didn't add, we just accepted this, it would be at least 5 workdays notice before a document would be placed in the personnel file. Under the statute, that's something that's for teachers, but this policy makes it applicable to all employees that you hold a document for 5 days before going to the file. And so we've accepted that as something that gives a little more notice to our employees that something is going to the personnel file. So we've accepted this modification from the School Boards Association to make it consistent across our employees. Under number 4, you'll see language indicating that employees shall be deemed to be on notice that written evaluations and observations placed in the file will be placed in the personnel file. That's something on the evaluation documents and says that we don't have to take any further action. Our practice is to normally go ahead and send those documents to the personnel file and for employees to understand that evaluation and observation of those documents are going to the personnel file. One modification that I would like to request right here that was not in the original, that was in our current policy and we forgot to pull over, is that if a document indicates that it's placed in the personnel file, like a CC personnel file, that no separate notice is required to the employee to have that document go to the personnel file.
What section?
This is under section C at the very bottom paragraph.
Okay.
So we would add a last sentence that says, further, if a document indicates that it is to be placed in the personnel file, no separate notice is required before placing it in the file. That's something already in our current policy that we just forgot to pull over.
Where on the page again?
If a document.
Where will it appear?
Oh, I'm sorry. At the bottom of page number 3, that very last paragraph.
You should add a sentence there in the very back.
Add the sentence at the end.
So employees shall be deemed to be on notice that written evaluations will be at the end of
That sentence. Okay, thank you. With regard to the other changes in this policy, again, we clarify on page 4 that the superintendent will refer a questionable complaint to the assistant superintendent to review to determine whether that complaint should be placed in the personnel file. Under the next paragraph, we just did a general statement saying other information will be placed in the file as required by state or federal law. The statement in that paragraph that is stricken talks about if someone is dismissed and notice of intent to recommend dismissal and release of information if in those circumstances. We just didn't feel like it was something that needed to be in this particular policy with regard to personnel file, and more was relevant to the resignation policy, so we struck it there. In section D of this policy, this is all consistent with legal requirements. There was an option to have here that an employee would be able to inspect the file with 3 workdays notices. We changed it to 5. That allows us to give time to put documents that may be going into the personnel file and get those in there before we have to provide that to the employee if those documents come in. The rest of this section really is consistent with legal requirements about who has access to an employee's personnel file and who can be released documents based upon the employee's personnel file. Section E of the policy is specific to, there's additional information if an employee is in a Title I school that can be released to a parent if they request it, like some of the licensure information and things like that. So we did lay that out here, or they did, the School Boards Association, and we kept that here in the policy. And then section F is about public information and the things that we are required, if requested by anyone, that we're required to provide with regard to an employee's personnel file. Section F also says that we will participate with the confidentiality program, which is something that we do. It clarifies that volunteer records are not public records, which is something that we also say and do. And it talks about protecting confidential identifying information. And finally, Section G, we just referenced our policy on petition for removal in Section G here in the policy.
All right. Any questions on personnel files? Chair, I'll move that we move into first reading.
Ms. McGabby, so I had a question. They're
You
trying
can
to get
still
out of
ask
here.
a question.
I do.
Okay, go ahead.
I do.
I couldn't tell if you were considering to ask or not, so I
I
don't
was
wanna-
considering, I just want clarification. Thank you, Ms. Hill. You've been absolutely amazing. Just with making sure I get everything. So I heard you mention about doing something different with putting things in people's personnel file, which I think is pretty cool to consider that. My question is...
5 day. I think, is that what you're talking about, the 5 day?
Well, you said before, just to figure out how you guys can work out differences. Remember you said that earlier, how you can work out differences before you just directly put stuff in people's personnel file and figure out how you can resolve that. So my question actually is, I think that's a great idea under some circumstances. However, how will you house the complaints or the differences that need to be worked on so that there is some type of paper trail or data trail, right? And then how will you determine in your in-office stuff about how long, or, yeah, I just need a little bit more clarity about, Ms. Johnson-Hanson might have to help me out. I think she knows what I'm saying. We was talking about what does that look like? What is that gonna look like, since that's a new process that you guys are thinking of? What would that look like for us? Is it anything like what we just discussed a few moments ago, where there are things where you'll show that it'll have it just won't go in people's file directly until it's resolved, and if it's resolved, is it necessary to go in their file? Yeah.
Let me just give some information from our employee relations perspective. So this is language that's not new language in terms of, these are statutory requirements that have already been there. And I believe even in our current policy. So it's not, that really is not new language with regard to adding information into the personnel file. In terms of requiring to add like complaints and things like that. But the school board's policy, I think rightfully says, and that's in, some of it is in statute as well, that the superintendent can select not to add those documents into the personnel file if there hasn't been an attempt to resolve a complaint, or if they find it irrelevant, outdated, invalid. Thank you, Sally. And so the policy kind of works in that language to make it clear to both our employees that there is a process to work that out. And so when complaints come in, most complaints, if they're not dealt with and resolved at the school level, come to us in employee relations. And employee relations is kind of kept separate from whatever happens in our general processes with our personnel file. And so only if a complaint led to some sort of, in terms of whether it was resolved. If it's something that's resolved, then in our mind, it doesn't need to go to the personnel file because the complaint has been dealt with. It's potentially irrelevant given that the issue has been addressed. If it's something where a complaint comes through and in fact we have to have some sort of disciplinary action or those sorts of things with regard to an employee, then those are the types of things that would go to the personnel file related to the complaint. It's really important, I think, to balance, and I don't want to say this in a negative way, but because we have a lot of people who just complain about other people, it's really hard to balance that. So and to think to permit those sorts of things or think that those sorts of things should just automatically be put in a person's personnel file. So that process of reviewing it, investigating it, determining whether in fact our employee has acted in a way that's not consistent with policy or not consistent with expectations or whatever that is, that's a process that we do and handle in employee relations. And then and that outcome may result in documentation to the employee file if in fact it is that sort of a situation. But there are going to be times where those complaints, someone's not willing to resolve it, they send information and there's not an effort to try to resolve it, or it may not be a legitimate complaint or things like that should not be recommended for the employee's personnel file.
And so my concern is the reoccurrences of how we're tracking this. And then when we have situations to where we say, well, we weren't aware. Well, parents or people have complained about a particular thing or a particular personnel person, and you all say it's resolved or you did something about it, but yet it's ongoing and recurring. How are we tracking the complaints? How are we tracking the fact that some things are happening and some parents have just given up with complaining, with their legitimate complaints, but our departments choose to go about it in a particular way, and children are emotionally harmed, families are emotionally scarred, but where's the track record to show we've been dealing with this same issue from this same person, and we constantly say, well, we took care of it, we talked about it, or we dealt with it. How are we tracking to be able to turn around when things pop up where now someone's took it to a deeper level, that where we can't ignore this incident, but we had a trail of incidents that were happening prior to. And so my concern is not to micromanage people, and I know we have to bring a delicate balance, but as a parent who'll be very transparent, when we share information with our principals that's happening with a teacher, or if we share information with area superintendents or other people of authority that's happening with principals, and it keeps happening and no one is addressing it, and then it blows up to something that's very harmful to children, like wanting to complete suicide because no one's been listening, we've got to do something a little different. So while this may be what policy has been, I think that this is a great opportunity that if we have to look at it a deeper way about changing that, because what I'm finding in community as well as my own lived experiences, we need a way to track it so that we can figure out when we're creating these plans for people how they can do it better based upon we resolve these small instances, but they constantly kept occurring. But because we're not keeping track of it and we just say we resolved it and it's not going in personnel file, how do we help the person move forward to not keep dealing with the small fat foxes that end up destroying the whole vine?
So I'm tracking with you now. I was thinking about what goes in the personnel file when you were talking, and things can eventually end up there. But I think it goes back to what the expectation is, because the policy clearly addresses maintaining records and keeping that. And so if that's what we're not doing a good job at, the policy absolutely speaks to it. We've just got to make sure that the expectation is there, that we have a way to monitor that. And that may be putting some systems in place or processes in place where there's consistency in how information is collected and maintained in a file. But before it goes into the personnel file, it will have to meet all of those standards. But I'm tracking with you now. It's about, are we keeping up with this stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And, we don't have a good system in place to do that now. That really is about the expectation and some procedural things that we can put in place. But I'm tracking with you now.
Okay.
I will step back for a moment because I think, because I've talked about things from the employee relations level, but a lot of things start before they ever get to us. And so I think you're talking a lot about what's happening at the school level, for example, and concerns that are expressed there. And I am very familiar with our principals who keep records of employees and issues that come with regard to those employees at the school-based level. I know that from the employee relation level because when we do a review of a concern, one of our questions is, has there been a school-based level concern? And so we go back to say, are there concerns? Because now this has risen to, to the employee relations level where we're looking at maybe a more significant concerns that's happened. But we check back to see, are there things where the principals addressed this issue previously, or there's been a prior complaint with this issue previously, that it's now boiled up some to a more significant issue. And there are times when we're addressing issues with employees on our levels where we will say, you were told by your principal on this date, or this was already addressed with you previously by your principal, and now we're seeing this matter happen again at a different scale. So I don't know. So in employee relations, we keep records, we keep files, we check to see if something has come to us previously with regard to an employee. We check to see if something has happened at the school with regard to an employee. Again, I know that schools on the school-based level, they keep those records as well. I think there is an opportunity for us to look at ways to make that be more, consistent across the district and something kept in a manner that is, as you say, something we can track and gather and those sorts of things. That's a growth opportunity for us as a district, I think, to do that and find the best way to maintain that information so that it is addressed. But I do know, at least as we are trying to deal with these issues, and when we talk to principals who are dealing with issues, they will often see, we have a lot of new principals, but they go back to the information that they have from the prior principals to say, yes, in fact, this person dealt with this issue, or this person attempted to address this issue. With regard. So I know that our schools have at least attempted to maintain that information. There are probably better ways as we move forward in the technological world to maintain that information. We don't have in the employee world similar to student files or student records, but I think we do have an opportunity to look at that as a way to maintain or to address ongoing concerns that there may be with regard to an employee.
I really would like for us to be able to do that at some point, Dr. Taylor. I really don't want that to go to the side because I think that can mitigate a lot of other things, particularly with even our principals, not just about teachers and staff, but even our principals.
So I have Ms. Caulfield and then Ms. Johnson-Hostler. Before we go on to these questions, what I'm going to do is say we take 7821 and push that to next time. I know it's just one more thing, but we've got like 4 more things. And so we'll continue the migration next time so we can move into the other pieces of the agenda. So Ms. Caulfield and then Ms. Johnson-Hostler.
My questions, I guess, or concerns, comments, whichever, kind of feed off of what Ms. Rice was saying. If we're not tracking the incidences and we're not putting everything in the file, there is no way to keep track, like what she was saying. And often you will have, and I was going to ask about the principal level because it's not always the teacher. Sometimes it's with the principal or the assistant principal. And a lot of times it may reflect on the school. So you may have them trying to handle it internally, and we don't have record of that. So when we do actually hear of something like this, anything, any administrator may be hearing about it for the first time, and that is not actually documented. But the reality is it's happening, right? And if it gets to the point where it becomes a complaint, that means somebody's already frustrated and having a hard time. And if we're just saying, okay, well, we talked to them about it, we worked it out, and we're going to move on, it doesn't mean that that's actually being resolved the way it needs to be at the student and parent level, or even the teacher level for that matter. So if it is worked out at the school and they do move on, what do we do? How do we find out like what the whole story is? Because if we're not putting it in the file because they've resolved it, I mean, the same thing could happen, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is if they did resolve it and it was documented, and it was explained by the principal, assistant principal, whoever was working on it, what the resolve was, that too is also documented, so we can follow that. But why would we not put that in there?
My experience has been that if it is resolved in a manner where it was not a valid complaint, or it's something that was a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, because again, it's hard to, I think when the statutes are written, the idea of a complaint is a whole different notion, right? A complaint that goes to a personnel file has to be signed by someone. Most complaints that we get nowadays are email communications and things like that. And so I think the statute has not necessarily grown to reflect what happens in our world today, where people shoot off complaints with or concerns in an email in a matter of seconds, and this information builds up. And I think that if something is a miscommunication, something is a misunderstanding, which we could generally call a complaint, those are the types of things that I think it's not in the employee's interest to document something like that to an employee's personnel file when there are concerns that are misunderstandings, miscommunications, things that are worked out in that way. I think when a school, my experience is that when something that comes in as a complaint is actually a real concern about an employee, the school lost it, and this is what we tell them, to document it at the school level. And if it's something that's repeated, then we talk about documenting it at the personnel file level. So that's something that we talk to principals about in terms of incremental documentation of concerns related to an employee. Address matters, performance matters, not just complaint matters, but address them, put the employee on notice of what the expectations are. If there's a concern, a more formalized documentation at the school level. If there continue to be concerns, a more formalized documentation at the central office personnel file level, and reflecting those within the evaluation process and observation process as well with regard to those employees. So at least in my experience, there are processes in place. There are school-based files that are kept on our employees. I think they're often paper files, but they are maintained in locked drawers, at our school levels with regard to ongoing concerns that may happen. And then our supervisors understand the expectation is to move those, if those are repeated concerns, that then starts to be documented with regard to the employee's personnel file.
And I'll just add quickly, because I know we're pressed for time, but when there are issues with an employee, that supervisor's responsibility is to try and resolve that, and they will keep the documentation, or should be keeping the documentation. But when it comes to the personnel file, I call this sort of the finality, saying that we tried to work through these things, but now is at the point to where we're not getting the results that we need. And it's going to be documented in your personnel file. And there may be some singular incidents that end up in the personnel file just because of the nature of it. And I think all employees understand that the serious nature of what goes in your file versus what a supervisor tries to work out before it comes there. But I kind of see that as the finality piece, if you will, when it comes to the personnel file.
So I think my concern was really more that there's many different levels. I think the policy is reading, it's more like the person who has a supervisor, like a teacher, for example, would be speaking to their principal. But what if it goes up from there? Yeah. And I think we all know that there's a very big difference between expectation and implementation. So that's my worry, is that in the wording, it kind of blurs that line.
Very good.
I think both Ms. Rice and Ms. Caulfield have expressed my concerns, and I want to reiterate. I agree with you, Dr. Taylor. I think the personnel file is your last opportunity because we've done everything we can. I do have the concern that there's not a paper trail. Again, I will go to the most extreme, since we've been talking about things that are extreme. When people have inappropriate behavior, and we're like, oh, and I'm only telling you this because I got a myriad of text messages from people at this district who are like, should I be concerned? Does this feel like sexual harassment to you? And they tell it again. Most people don't understand the complexities that these are issues that escalate. And so my concern is, that's egregious, but there are other cases where behaviors escalate if you keep giving me the option for people who are just going to perpetrate bad behavior. We're human. That is a very real thing. There are good people who do bad things. And so I don't believe that the very initial things that we feel like we work through should be in a personnel file. My concern is there's not consistency, and we just passed a policy that says 30 days and they leave and go to another school. The other school doesn't have that documentation. And yes, you're right, some principals will say, hey, Dr. Matillo, Mr. Swanson works for me. Can you tell me anything? Some principals are swamped and they don't have that time, right? Because Dr. Matillo let Mr. Swanson come, so he must be fine. And so we then perpetuate that kind of behavior throughout our district. And because we're a large district, that is easy for someone like that to get lost in the district. And when it's on the news, then we're all surprised. And so while I don't think those behaviors that we are working out in a conversation should be in a personnel file, I do think the district should have some, here is what we expect you to be documenting when these things come to you. Otherwise, if it makes it to HR, you can have somebody who has nothing on that person. And again, what do we know that happens? 20 other teachers are like, oh no, we knew that. And I guess I'm saying we keep finding ourselves in this situation. There's not anything that hasn't made the news that anyone was shocked by, except for us sitting at this table. Right, and and I don't know what that looks like, and I'm not arguing that you change the policy. I'm more saying I hope you got an RFP that helps people understand that it is this board's expectation that you're documenting those things, so we're not constantly surprised.
I think you're absolutely right that as the district gets larger, then that consistency can fail. And so when you talk about a district that has 25 or less schools, everybody has an opportunity to talk, including what those expectations are. But 200,
I don't know how you do that.
Yeah.
So I don't have an answer, but that's my concern. Dr. Taylor knows he'll figure it out.
So one of the things that we can do is
Mr. Swanson's got a clean file for the record. Says Mr. Swanson, not Dr.
Says
Matillo.
Mr. Swanson. We don't know.
I'll talk to Dr. Matillo later.
We can look to add some language about, maintaining those things at the school-based level. But I think it is, again, about looking at a system that allows us to have something that, is maintained outside of the
I agree.
central office level.
Oh, you're not getting an argument
Yeah.
there. It's just,
We-
loosely, there's nothing outside of the personnel file.
Right. I mean, it's there, but
Well, it's
the
loose.
question of, it is loose, yes. And it is different. I will tell you, from a training perspective, we try to emphasize the need to maintain and document at the school-based level concerns with regard to an employee, because we have had those circumstances where
Yes, we have.
we've gotten everybody knew that was an issue, and we've not seen anything there. So it is a part of training that we continue to do with our supervisors to make sure, not just, I don't want to just say it's school-based level and principals, because it's something
It's
for all of our supervisors, to make sure that they are documenting concerns, and it's not something that is a aha, 10 years later that everybody knew was happening.
Ms. Hall, I don't know how much time you have to think about this, but I know that you'll think about what I'm about to say because I've watched you do this before. I appreciate that this is a training, but I guess what I'm saying is, if I'm sitting in a training and I have not had any problems, I hear you, but it doesn't really matter to me today because I don't have problems in my school or in my department. My concern is, or my question is, it'd be great if I know that when you train me, you tell me, hey, when you have these types of issues come up, here's where you put those. And again, I'm sad that a district this large doesn't have an HR platform that allows you to document things that don't go to a personnel file, right? I run a small business. I got an HR platform that I can document small things in that don't go in the permanent file. And so I guess that's what I'm saying is, yes, and I think there needs to be a tool so that I can say, ooh, Ms. Hill told me in that training that when I have this is what I do with it. Again, I'm back to human behavior. I don't need it till I need it.
Working on it.
I knew you would be. That's why I said it. Thank you, Ms. Hill. I knew you would be. I know how your brain works now. So
And
thank
when
you.
somebody thinks it's
you.
resolved, they move on, right? So it's not, they're not thinking about documentation, and then somebody else comes up with the same concern. They're like, oh, I haven't heard that before. It doesn't mean it wasn't there. It just means it wasn't documented.
All right, understood.
So it's hard to see those patterns forming, I'm saying.
Thank you all for sharing that. Those are very important areas for us to look at.
My motion stands, I believe.
Second.
So we have a motion by
Well, Ms.
Ms.
Hill had a
Evans, a
recommendation,
second
but I'll let your
from,
motion stand.
yeah.
I'll bring it to second reading.
And I think we
Because she had
have
a
future
recommendation.
discussion based on those little pieces that, you know, where our families or staff members may feel concerned, so they don't have to get to the point where they're filing a grievance and then they don't know where to begin because the list is long. Yeah.
If there is a recommendation, are we proceeding with a vote or getting the recommendation?
I mean, do you want to flesh it out a little more, Ms. Hill?
We were just going to add a sentence in here to ensure that, that they are maintaining records of complaints and things.
Yeah, I wasn't
at
sure if
the-
they heard it since we were passing
Okay.
our original motion, but you had a recommendation.
Yeah, so we will add that sentence in there as well for the next, craft it.
So that actually
and for-
changes your
to
motion.
come for
That's
first
wasn't
reading.
hearing your motion.
So it's a new motion, but we'll hold her to that. So, all right, with that, all those in favor with the forthcoming changes, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, so we're going to push 7821 to a separate one in consultation with Chair Haggerty. Sustainability and student behavior, student code of conduct may be on the docket for either next month or potentially at work session, and we will let you all know where we land with that. And because we only have 15 minutes left, we're going to do settlement of claims. Because I don't think 10 minutes, even if we get this done very quickly, is enough time to address either of these two big issues. And I think they deserve the time allotted. So I appreciate Chair Haggerty for the suggestion and the flexibility. And as always, appreciate the robust discussion.
Thank you all.
Thank you, staff.
Thank you. Because sometimes this is the first time that we're seeing these things, or the only time that we're going to see things like evaluation and personnel files, and so I think we have to go through those pieces. So thank you, Ms. Hill.
We appreciate a robust discussion.
All right. So with that, we're going to look at 8623 settlement of claims. I believe Mr. Nieder is joining us for that. And this is something that was discussed in closed session, or not in closed session, but in a work session,
Yeah.
or,
Yeah.
and so we're just kind of formalizing what we've already discussed. So
Yes.
Dr. Crane?
Sure. This is, we had this at our last committee meeting, my file here, and the board asked us to bring back for consideration a document that has a $30,000 settlement approval limit for the superintendent, as well as to include language about tolling agreements up to 90 days, and then finally a reporting segment as well. So those are the parts that have been added. Neil has reviewed those, Nader has reviewed those, and so given your input last time, we're bringing this document back for your consideration.
Ms. Edmonds?
I need a reminder about what tolling agreements are. So can you please repeat that?
Mr. Ramey,
I can
spotlight on
answer
you.
that. Yeah, tolling agreement is when both parties in the dispute agree to not to assert statute of limitations or other time defenses for a period of time to give you an opportunity to resolve a case. So an example might be a parent, the lawyer lets us know they're going to file a lawsuit by the deadline, which is tomorrow or next week, and we don't have time to get to a board meeting, so this would authorize Dr. Taylor to say, I'll authorize this tolling agreement of no more than 30 days to see if we can resolve this before you get up against your filing deadline.
Thank you.
Melissa, it's 3 months.
3 months, sorry.
Okay.
Not yes.
Making sure.
90
All right.
days, not 30 days. You're right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Ms. Caulfield?
When we were talking about this the last time, I thought we were, It is in there to regularly provide a written report. Did we put in the verbiage when?
Once a quarter?
Yeah.
Or, okay. Once a, yeah. Dr. Taylor, what would best suit, because you're going to be the point person then for all these attorneys.
I mean, if you want it done quarterly, I'm fine with that. What I can tell you is, depending on the level that may come up, I may provide you a report that's more than every quarter. But quarterly is what you want, I'm fine.
Yeah, I think that's good. And then if we find that we need to make it monthly or bi-monthly, we'll change it. But let's go with that and see how it goes, and trust that if it's something that we need to know about, you'll bring it to us.
Do you all want to revise the policy to reflect that, or so what if we were to add at the end of that sentence, it would read all settlements in excess of $10,000 that are approved by the superintendent pursuant to this policy will be reported to the board on at least a quarterly basis?
Yes.
Yes.
That work?
Wait, say that again, where are you putting that?
At the end of the sentence that requires reporting to the board, all settlements in excess of $10,000 that are approved by the superintendent pursuant to this policy will be reported to the board on at least a quarterly basis.
30,000.
30,000. So they filled
Sorry,
in
that-
that blank 30,
Okay.
if
So-
you want to see here.
Oh, that's going to be 30? So, well, okay, that could be 30. It could also be 10. It's up to you all.
And
So
then
that's what was throwing me, that we went from.
30,000 would definitely go in the first blank, which is the superintendent's authority to settle claims.
But so, yeah, the original language has all settlements. And then if you say 30 settlements, you're giving us a report on the ones we've actually reviewed and voted on.
Okay,
So
by
it's,
design.
the difference, the ones that we wouldn't be seeing would be the ones between 10 and 30, because anything over 30, we've already reviewed.
Yeah, I think it could go either way. I guess Julie and I had a little discrepancy on this. It's really up to the board. The draft I had, which, I mean, I think Julie understandably thought it was a typo because there was two different numbers. My draft was based on the assumption no change in the reporting requirements you currently have, which is everything over 10,000 you get notice of. If we stick with that, we keep the 10,000 there, and that's the status quo. And all we're doing then is increasing the superintendent's authority to actually approve the settlement from 10 to 30.
Okay.
You do have different verbiage.
That's what I thought we were.
My
Yes,
apologies.
looks like we have
My apologies.
we have different
I
drafts.
didn't understand the two
And-
different numbers were by design as opposed to.
That's okay.
He's looking.
And we do have different drafts too. I guess I'm not.
Everything
You don't have
else
my
is the
draft.
same except
It's
that.
different.
Everything else is the same except that number.
So what's
Oh, I
the
see.
proposed reconciliation?
Bottom
Yeah.
Cheryl,
paragraph is
Ms.
different.
Caulfield's looking at something different than what you're showing me here.
Do
Looks
you
like we
have
three
something
versions.
different?
So what we have in
Am I looking at
assembly is
wrong
different than what you have?
What Ms. Caulfield's showing me is different than what
Here's
Julie's
So
showing me.
Mr. Ramey has a different draft than we do, because he has his original
Yeah,
draft. We
his
have
is
what was put in
completely
assembly.
This is what,
So
yeah.
what's the verbiage that you're proposing? Neil?
Well, okay, what I have is just
that last sentence?
for the last sentence, well, I mean, I can summarize what I have in my, it's a little bit different. What I have was first to add, just plug in the blank or replace 10,000 with $30,000 in the first sentence, and add at the end of that paragraph, settlements in excess of this amount require board approval, just to leave no uncertainty on that. Then I have a new sentence, a new paragraph that reads, all settlements in excess of $10,000 that are approved by the superintendent pursuant to this policy will be reported to the board. That's the status quo. And then finally, the sentence on tolling agreements, I have this, when additional time is needed to present a proposed settlement to the board at a regularly scheduled meeting, the superintendent, in consultation with the board attorney, is authorized to enter into tolling agreements of up to 90 days on the board's behalf.
So what we have is drastically different.
It is different.
And maybe not in substance, but the wording is very,
Yeah,
very
we
different.
have
So
it.
I would rather see that for myself
Yeah.
before we,
Do you all want to hold this, or do you want me to email it to you right now to look at, or? I think the substantively it's similar, but
Yeah, it means the same thing,
Yeah.
but
I'm
the wording
getting
very
there, but
different.
it
I
doesn't
see what you're
read
saying.
at
Three
all.
separate paragraphs that
Yeah.
are completely different.
Yeah.
I'd rather,
Send me the email and I will send it
Okay.
to all board members.
Okay.
And I'll include Dr. Taylor and Mr. Nieder and Dr. Robinson on it, and Chief Ellis, and whoever I happen to see.
Okay, I just sent you the.
In the context of the 6 minutes we have remaining. See how fast Outlook wants to work today. Because we're
I just
waiting on
changed the color.
time front.
Yeah, the wrong version got uploaded.
Yeah.
I feel like we need to have like policy hold music or something. Yeah.
Substantively, it's the same. It's just
It's right up there on Walnut Street. It's
Yeah.
really good. Yeah, on the other side where you come up.
Yeah. I got nothing, Neil.
So it might take a while to get through the 2 servers, but
Well, Chairman
yeah.
Happy,
I was like,
I'd
he's
move at this
already
point,
said
we
he's not
just
gonna get it through.
move to table the discussion
Yep.
and bring it back at the next meeting.
I think we're
It's the
gonna
first
have
day of school, Lukenberg is locked down.
Yeah.
Don't worry, the kids will crack it
All
today.
right, so with that, we're going to, again, figure out whether sustainability and the code of conduct discussion ends up in work session or in our September meeting. I have a note that there will be a future discussion on displacement of teachers based on an earlier discussion. And then we will revisit 7821 petition for removal of personnel records coming forward. So, and then with information on technology and responsible use, they are getting a survey out to folks, so that is coming in October. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you. All right, thanks all.
All right, thank you.